quite a few of our undergraduates here, because I was a bit worried that there wouldn't be incentive enough for them to come. So thank you for being here, and thank you also to the others. This talk is about how you can identify gender biases and patterns in gender biases that you might not otherwise identify using data, using census data and survey data. Quick overview about the organization of the talk. This particular lecture is the last of a series of 6 lectures delivered to our BSc program, IRDR 0023, on the practice and analysis of humanitarian action. And there was a lecture last term that Maureen gave that some of you even wrote about in your summative assessment, where Maureen focused on gender issues and the importance of looking at gender and challenges surrounding gender and related issues in humanitarian action. Who remembers why it was important to look at gender? It's one of those things that time. Anyway, no? Right. So gender is really important because often when a crisis occurs or in international development, you find that there are many inequalities, many biases that, to the detriment of one gender or another, that happen. And often humanitarian crises happen in situations where you have underlying inequalities that were existent even before the crisis occurred. And often when a crisis happens, these inequalities can be exacerbated. So looking at it is really important, because when it comes to addressing these issues, you then can have targeted policies. Now, in this lecture, we will be not just looking at identifying gender-based differences at the aggregate level, but we'll go a bit further. We'll be looking at whether we can use data to identify differences within a household, right? So can we actually pick up what happens within a household using data? And I hope by the end of this lecture, you will be as excited as I am about the potential of data to uncover these differences at the aggregate level and at the household level. And again, why is it important? It's really important to understand the mechanisms underlying gender biases, and it's important to understand the mechanisms, because only then can we address, can we target policy or address the issue effectively. Right, so the first example will be about how we identify differences using census data, aggregate differences, and the second would be how we identify within household differences. Okay, so how do we identify aggregate differences in an economy, in a society? The example that I'm going to use is comes from Amartya Sen. Hands up who's heard of Amartya Sen? He was a Nobel Prize winner in economics. I can't remember when, but so he won the Nobel Prize for economics somewhere in the 2000s, I think. A development economist, but also a philosopher. And he wrote this seminal paper about how 100 million women were missing. And what he basically did was, this is a paper in the 1990s. I think it was published in 1990. What he did was, it was something quite simple. He used census data. You know what census data is, right? So census data is not very detailed data. It's basically data collected from everybody in an economy. And often it happens because it's very costly to interview everybody and know, basic sort of demographic characteristics and other characteristics about the population. Often it's collected every 10 years. So what Sen did was something really clever. he used census data to obtain male to female ratios, right? Just the gender ratio. And he noticed that for all the countries on that map that's pink, right, for those areas, and that's Europe and North America, the female to male ratio was 1.06 to 1, right? So for every 1.06 females, there was one male. And that's not very surprising because that's about the normal ratio, right? Just to have a bit more women than men, because the survival rates for female infants, for example, is a bit higher than that for male infants. So that's normal. But quite in contrast, when you use the census data to calculate the female to male ratio in South Asia, mainly India, so that statistic is dominated by India, West Asia, that's the Middle East, and China, you have one male for every 0.94 females. So do you notice that the gender ratio, there's a big gap, right? So then Sen went on to calculate in terms of numbers, how much is that? And it turned out to be 100 million. So his question was, where are these women? They're just missing women. Where are these 100 million women? Where do you think they are? So this paper generated quite a lot of discussion. Quite a lot of controversy, discussion, but in his paper and in subsequent papers, this missingness was attributed to selective abortion, female infanticide. You know, there's male preference in some of these countries. You must have read articles about China's male preference, India's male preference, boy bias. So it was attributed to that. Inadequate health care, to the detriment of mothers, maybe when they're giving birth to children, or women, or adolescent girls. Nutrition differentials for men and women, again to the detriment of women, that causes their mortality to be higher than that of males. So there was quite a lot of discussion after this. There were controversies, but his key finding remains. As far as aggregate data goes, based on data for the 1980s, there was this big discrepancy, and this was led by countries like India and China, and there was this issue of missing women. So you can use aggregate, you can use things like census data to reveal such patterns, and that's quite exciting, because the sort of the discussion that followed this meant that policy and the evidence for policy becomes much more sort of glaring in terms of its evidence, because you actually see it in the data. So that's identifying differences, an example of identifying differences using census data. But the rest of my talk is going to focus on something that I think is much more exciting in a way. You see, when you have aggregate differences like this, and if you're a policymaker, if you're a humanitarian worker, if you want to intervene somehow or understand what's going on, it's not enough to look at what's happening at the aggregate, right? You've got to look at what's happening within societies. In fact, you've got to look at what's happening within households. And the rest of this talk is about how you can investigate what happens within households using data. Now, this is obviously very, very different, right? Think of your own household. Think of how you and your partner sort of bargain. How do you bargain when you want some outcome? How are resources distributed? Think of your parents and you. Who has more bargaining power? Think of your brothers and sisters. Modeling this is incredibly difficult. I'm not going to, I mean, economists spend quite a lot of time trying to model this from a theoretical perspective, to understand how household members bargain. Is there conflict? Is there cooperation? Do households actually behave as a unitary entity, Or does each person sort of maximize their own objective function, as we economists might call it? And what are the sort of implicit and explicit rules of the game? So these are things that economists do. And why do you model? Because you really want to understand how resources are allocated within a household. So in this talk, when I talk of resource allocation, what I'm talking of is things like education expenditure, inputs, food inputs towards health and human capital, even leisure time, right? Is it true that sometimes men enjoy more leisure time than do women? I mean, does that happen? Does it happen in all communities? Think of COVID times. You find lots of articles during COVID times where people were saying that in spite of lockdown, in spite of everybody being at home, men and women, there was some discussion about how the burden of caregiving was more on the women, right, rather than the men. So there was some sort of inequity in terms of how leisure time was allocated. Now, to understand all this, you basically need a theoretical model, and this is what some economists do, microeconomists do. And the main reason that you do this is because then you understand how to target policy better. Now, if you don't quite believe me, wait till the end of the talk, and hopefully you'll be convinced about why it's really important to understand the underlying dynamics. So what we will talk about here is not the theoretical modeling, but just using data that we can identify patterns in gender-based biases. But before we go to that, let's talk a little bit why there might be within household inequalities in how resources are allocated. I'm going to focus on children, right? So how resources are allocated between boys and girls, for example. I'm going to look at the international development literature. So this basically focuses on developing countries. And I've got some reasons there that have been put forward to say why this gender-based bias might be happening. So one of the reasons is that there could be discrimination, there could be favoritism. So there could be a son preference, for example. And a lot of work has been done on this area. So for example, Jayachandran and Pandey in a 2017 paper, and using 168,000 observations from India and Africa, and this is how economists normally analyze, right? You've got lots and lots of data sets. They find that there are these biases that affect fertility decisions and resource allocation that transpires as differences in heights among boys and girls. In my masterclass last week, I was telling you about how height is a really good proxy for accumulated investments in child health. So if you find on average a particularly short child or stunted child compared to a child that's not stunted, you could say that that is partly due to the health inputs that the stunted child or both children got throughout their lives. So height is a really good indicator. So there could be discrimination, there could be favoritism. Some argue that it could be a matter of preference and taste as well, based on cultural norms. So for example, in South Asia, you find sometimes in societies in India, parents choose to spend more on boys' education, but for girls, they choose to spend on collecting jewelry and assets that can be given as a dowry at the time they marry. Who has heard of the concept of dowry? Shall I? So I don't need to explain dowry. So a dowry is a gift that the bride's parents give the couple at the time the daughter marries. And often a very good dowry can fetch a very good husband, right? So a big dowry, you have lots of gold, lots of money, a house, a car, and you might get a husband who is more financially stable, for example, right? So what parents are doing is trying to maximize the daughter's well-being over her lifetime. So that's not discrimination. So you're not investing as much on your daughter's education compared to your son's education because cultural norms dictate that she's better off actually if she finds a more stable husband, financially stable husband, rather than having a job. She would probably have an easier life, arguably. So that's a picture there of a typical Indian bride with all her jewelry. So that could be one reason why there's this discrimination, or not discrimination, this sort of differential observed. Another reason, of course, as to why a parent, like you might notice this in your own households, right? Your parents might spend more on your brother's education rather than yours, or your sister's education rather than yours, because either they need more support, right? So they need more tuition just to help them more, or maybe that they're so good in a particular skill, music or whatever. So extra tuition is given to them to develop that skill. So part of this within household differences that you find in resource allocation could be due to differences in initial endowments. Kirchberger finds another interesting reason. She argues that this differential within households might be due to how parents reward children differently. So if you have the opportunity as a child to go out into the labor market as an adolescent, say, and bring in more money, contributing to the household economy, then you're given more leisure time compared to a daughter who doesn't, say, go out as much, and she has to do more work at home. So it's sort of a balancing of what, it's a way of rewarding to how much you contribute to the household economy. Another interesting idea is not an idea, an interesting finding is that within household differentials in resource allocation might be strongly correlated to labor market outcomes. So in India, the survival probabilities of girl children in a particular region, it was found, was strongly correlated to female employment opportunities. And the argument that those authors basically had was that parents tend to invest more in boys' health because, so using the word invest, right? So you're investing more in your son's health because the return to that investment is higher for the son because he has more opportunities in the labor market. And there are sort of insurance things, arguments happening here as well. So for example, if you don't have a formal insurance system in place, sometimes your children are your insurance. And if when your son marries, if he stays with you, as it is with some cultures, it is your son who will look after you in your old age. So you invest more in that child's education, maybe, because again, it's the insurance aspect or the returns to insurance aspect. Some argue that that's one interpretation, but another reason just could be that in areas where women have more employment opportunities, women have more bargaining power. So you can actually feed your daughters better. So lots and lots of different reasons that development economists have identified using data as to explain within household differentials that might happen. What the types of methods economists generally use involve using household survey data, right? Now, household survey data are very sort of interesting, common, and unique data source. And examples are things like the British Household Survey Panel, where the same household is interviewed every 2 years or every 3 years from a long, long time. And household survey data can be very, very detailed, right? So you have enumerators actually going to households, sitting with the household head, sitting with the children, and tediously filling questionnaires about household consumption, income, time use, health, mental health, physical health. So these surveys can be really, really detailed and incredibly useful. You find like very special household surveys that people carry after, say, tsunamis. The World Bank's Living Standard Measurement Survey is an incredibly useful resource because it's the same survey that's replicated in many countries. So you can actually compare it as well. Now, economists use these household surveys. Now, if you want to identify patterns, such as, is more health expense or is more education expenditure, does it go towards boys or girls? Ideally, what do you think the household survey should have? So you want to find out, imagine we're all one family, and I want to find out whether Felix is favored of it and more is spent on Felix, right? So when I gather the data, what sort of data do I need? Normally what household surveys do is we look at income for the entire household. I'm the household head, and I will tell the enumerator, yeah, we earn about 100K a year, right? That's what household surveys normally do. But if you want to understand within household differences, is that good enough? What do you need to know? I need to know exactly how much is spent on Felix, how much is spent on Victoria, how much is spent on Harry. Do you get that? Yeah? And that's very costly, and very few household surveys do that, right? Very, very few do that. What's more common is to have aggregate expenditure. So they ask you, okay, what's your total household education expenditure? What's your total household health expenditure for the past month, right? So what we then need to do is think of a clever way in which we can exploit that data to identify some sort of pattern about what's happening inside the household. Right? It's a very hard job, very difficult job. Impact evaluation is bad enough. This is hard. And what I'll do in the next sort of 10 minutes is try and show you, talk about a specific paper that I wrote and the method that I use. And it's really exciting because the results are, I think, are worth listening to. Right, so here's the example. So bear with me for 10 more minutes before we talk of the really exciting stuff. I mean, this is exciting, but the stuff to come is even more exciting. Right, so this paper was one that I wrote in 2010. And it was published in a really good economics journal called Economics Development and Cultural Change. And what I did in this paper was to look at within household allocation of education expenditure in Sri Lanka. Now, developing countries have been a testing ground to see if there are biases in gender-based biases and school-based biases as well, right? And a lot of the papers that have been done at that time almost always showed that the bias favored men, boys. And my interest was to look at Sri Lanka to see if what we noticed at that time in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh was also true for Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka is a bit of an outlier. It's in the Indian Ocean at the bottom. It's an island just below India. But it's an outlier because it was very different to other South Asian countries for the past many decades. And it is very different because, anybody knows why? Can you guess why it's very different to other South Asian countries? Yeah. What's that? Favors women? Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether it favors women, but as far as the data goes, there's a lot of gender parity. So school enrollment, for example, is universal for boys and girls, primary school enrollment. Literacy rates were really high, like 90% ever since the 1970s for men and women. And if you look at secondary school enrollment, it's slightly more for women than it is for men, right? So it's quite good. And in terms of incomes at that time, it was a low-income country, but their Human Development Index was as high as developed country human development indices. So it was a bit different like that. So what I wanted to notice, I wanted to look at was, you see, in India, you find some states boasting of gender parity in terms of school enrollment. But if you actually look at, so boys and girls are both enrolled in school, but parents tend to send the boys to private schools and the girls are not sent. So there is a gender bias. So I wanted to see whether this sort of gender bias was there for Sri Lanka as well. So at the time, there was a war in Sri Lanka. So the bit in orange was the war in the north and east. So my data set doesn't include the north and east. The data I used is called, it's called Household Income Expenditure Survey. So every country, any Department of Census and Statistics that you go to, website that you go to, will have household surveys, household income and expenditure surveys. So if any of you are doing a master's or you want to do a PhD and you want household level data, that's the source that you go to, income expenditure surveys. So I used income expenditure surveys for 3 years, covering a decade, because we economists are very, very particular about robustness, right? We don't want a one-off result. We want to check if what we noticed is actually a pattern. So I used 3 years. Every year had about 10,000 households, and I only picked households that had a child between ages 5 to 19. That's schooling age, right? And the data is of good quality. Education in Sri Lanka is free from kindergarten to university. So yeah, even university education is free. So education expenditure is roughly 2% of the household budget, because households still have to spend on uniforms, travel, books, tuition, shadow education, and things like that, right? Okay, so the data that I have, now don't get put off by this, I'll explain it to you as best as I can and take only a minute. The data that I have is household survey data. So I have education expenditure for the household, but I do have information about how many boys, how many girls are there in the household, right? The demographic composition I found. So what I use to sort of extract whether there is a gender bias is to use what you call an Engel framework. So I look at that WI, that's the budget share of education. So I'm trying to explain the budget share of education as a function of all these other things that I think influence that budget share. So don't worry about all this. So that's the dependent variable, and over here are all the independent variables. The really important bit here is what you find within this summation sign, right? What I have there is a sort of information about the household disaggregated by male and female and age group. So I had the number of boys aged 5 to 9 years, the number of girls aged 5 to 9, the number of boys aged 10 to 14, girls aged 10 to 13, boys aged 10 to 13, girls aged 14 to 16, boys. So that was like a group of variables, a group of demographic variables. Now, when you run the regression, there will be this coefficient that's estimated against each of those categorical variables, right? This variable gamma. The way you figure out whether there is a bias towards boys or girls is to look at that gamma variable. Compare the gamma for girls versus boys of a particular age group. So say, for example, you take age group 14 to 16, right? This is GCSEs. So these are kids who are studying towards their GCSEs. And if you get a gamma value of minus 0.9, what that means is that adding an extra girl to the household reduces the household budget by 0.9%. Adding an extra girl compared to a boy reduces the household budget by 0.9%. But if you didn't quite understand that, it doesn't matter. It's we'll just move on to the results. There's a bit more that I need to tell you as well. So when you model like this, there's a bit of a problem because you find about 25% of the sample, they go to school, but they haven't incurred any education expenditure in the past month, because that's how they ask these questions. They say, in the past month, what was your education expenditure? So there are two decisions that are conflated here. One is whether you go to school or not, and the other is you're at school, Is anything spent on you or not? So putting both together is a bit of a problem. So what I do is I then have a more complicated model called a double hurdle model that I estimate using maximum likelihood that can actually separate this decision. But fundamentally, what I do is I compare the gamma values. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, you are welcome to do the paper. So that's a complicated model that I'm not going to talk about. I'll talk about the results instead. And the results are fun. What I noticed is, and it's an F test that compares this gamma coefficient, right? I noticed that for age groups 5 to 9, 14 to 60, and 17 to 19, adding an extra girl rather than a boy in the family increases household expenditure significantly for 1990 and 1995. For the year 2000, the bias favors enrollment for age category 17 to 19 and expenditure for age category 14 to 16. Don't worry too much about the categories. I'll explain what that means. What that means is this. You know, the way so my age categories are 5 to 9, 10 to 4, 10 to 13, 14 to 16, and 17 to 19. And you notice this significant bias favoring girls in terms of education expenditure in rural areas. Only you don't notice for the age group 10 to 13. There's something very special about all the other age categories. These are the run-up to really important public exams, right? So at age 9, you have an exam called the Grade 4 Scholarship Exam. That's very important in rural areas, and this is based on rural areas, because that allows your children to go from a poor sort of rural school to a really competitive secondary school in town. So it's really important, and parents spend a lot of resources making sure that the kids can pass their maths and Sinhalese or Tamil exams. 14 to 16 is also really important because it's the run-up to the GCSEs. The education system is pretty much like the education system in the UK. 17 to 19 is A-levels. So what are parents doing? So rural Sri Lankan parents seem to be spending more on their girls rather than their boys in the run-up to major public exams. Wow. That's exciting, isn't it? I mean, it's not exciting because it's exciting, but it's exciting as a pattern to observe. So, so I was very excited when I found this. I was like, really? Could that happen? Because I think I started with 2 series, and I did it for many years. I did many things to sort of make sure that this result was robust, and I'll talk about it a little bit. But the fundamental point is, this is very different to the story you hear in India. This is very different to the sort of the pro-boy bias story that you hear in a lot of discourses. Correct? So here's a bias that actually disfavors boys, and significantly. So I, of course, as I said, you can't get a result like that and just leave it, right? That's not being a good economist. That's not being a good researcher. That's not being a good humanitarian. If you notice a bias, you've got to go and explore, like, why did you get that result? And the first thing you do when you get a result like this with data or something else is see if you made a mistake, right? So one of the first things that I did was I was wondering, is this just noise in the data? Is this just a one-off thing? So I did the same analysis for urban areas, for example. Urban areas didn't have that difference, right? And I sort of changed my age categories to other groups. No matter what I did, the run-up to exams were times when parents went more. So I did lots and lots of things, and I eliminated that it was something to do with the noise in the data or my modeling. Then I wondered, I mean, in Sri Lanka, does it actually have a cultural bias against boys? Is there a girl bias? If that's true, then you must notice that bias for, say, health expenditure and other expenditures, right? So that wasn't the case either. And you find lots of qualitative studies, there's nothing to indicate that there's like a female preference at all. So that's right. Could it be a matter of taste? Like all these kids in that sample went to state schools because private schools were just non-existent almost at that time in Sri Lanka. So could it be that girls like nice school bags and books and stickers on their books? Could it be that going to school was more dangerous for girls and parents actually spent more on travel maybe or accompanying them? Is that what's causing the increase in the bias? No, it wasn't that either. So I actually disaggregated by item category and found that the expenditure was actually going towards books and shadow education. So they're actually getting more private tuition. And in any case, this bias is only seen in the run-up to exams. You don't notice for the 10 to 13-year group. Could it be a dowry story? Like parents are now, the political economic climate is such that now you've got to invest in girls as well. So there's some sort of something like that that's happening. And that wasn't true either. And you can read up about the many things I did to sort of say that that wasn't the case. The most plausible explanation is that the parents need to make sure that their girls get their formal qualifications, because those formal qualifications are a signal in the labor market. And that signal is more important for girls than it is for boys. So I noticed that using a different data set, for every occupation category, girls in Sri Lanka are on average more educated than boys were. So if you were a girl, or rather, if you were a boy, there was a privilege associated when it comes to the labor market. You can be less educated than a girl and vie for the same job and get it, or you can you have just more opportunities, more jobs that you can do. And there are also cultural things, like you'd rather have your girl working as a teacher or in some sort of professional capacity rather than working as a taxi driver, for example, or a trishaw driver. You know those tuk-tuks that you find, or bus driver. So there's some sort of shame associated with employment like that as well. So it's a labor market story. And then you think, hang on a minute, if girls have to study more, but boys are actually paid more in the labor market, what's the problem? Is that a problem? Is that a bias that you need to fix? I think it is, because if the roles were reversed, there'd be just so much discussion and talk about it. Because I did a recent paper that looks at what has happened to the situation now. And what you notice now is that not only do parents spend more, boys are actually falling behind at school as well. So 70% of those who entered medical school in 2016 or 17 were female. So boys are just females. So there are less boys, less men in professional jobs. They're doing all sorts of other jobs, and the disparity is alarmingly high. So there is a problem here, right? And then you have associated problems. Educated girls don't want to marry uneducated boys who just have their GCSEs. And then you find, that has implications on the marriage market. Now, you might be quite surprised when I say things like marriage market. You probably never thought of marriage as a market, but that's how we economists talk. We talk of children as insurance, marriage markets, and I'm sure I'll be able to sort of brainwash you by the time you do microeconomics next term with me, or macro next term. But okay, so that's the story. Right, so what are the conclusions that we draw out of this analysis? Conclusion number one is that gender-based inequalities do not always disfavor women, right? When you look at the data, when you look at patterns, you do notice that you have to look at the boys, you have to look at the men as well, because the inequalities are not as obvious as it may seem all the time, right? But then the other point is that these inequalities are almost always a part of a bigger story. So when you guys are humanitarians going out there and working, noticing something that seems terribly unequal, don't jump to fix that problem without looking at why that problem occurs. What is behind this? What is the reason? What is the cause? For Sri Lanka's gender-based bias in terms of education expenditure, the problem is at the household level, but the solution seems to be at the labor market, right? Make the labor market more equal. So you might notice inequalities, but be very, very careful in prescribing remedies for this, because without first looking at why it happens. And often the story is much, much more complex than you might think. Finally, census data, and more importantly, household survey data are really, really important resources that you can use in the practice and analysis of humanitarian action. Now, perhaps in the emergency phase, but more so in the phase just before the emergency, as well as the recovery phase and the resilience phase. So I'll stop there. And please, let's start our discussion. And do you have any questions?
Thank you for this. I was wondering if you had a look, or if even there was a way to quantify the impact of conflict towards these choices. I was just thinking, maybe if family thinks, all right, my boy has more chances. Well, if I want to be picking my words, die in a conflict, I'd rather invest in the girl.
Yeah. Yes.
So
there's lots and lots of work. There's lots of work done on conflict situations and the impact that has on various aspects. Like one interesting paper was about how, due to a conflict situation, the government decided to reduce the number of schooling years. So instead of making it 16 years, they sort of compressed the last 2 years or last 3 years into a 2-year system. And that apparently really benefited women more than it did the men. So there is a lot of work done on various aspects. So for Indonesia, for example, that was not a conflict situation, but that was a post-tsunami situation. It was found that adolescents are the ones who, adolescent orphans, in fact, and adolescent boys are the ones who leave school early because they can go off to the labor market and earn, and the girls stay on and get educated because, again, like you say, it's better for the boys to actually go there and help the household economy and the girls not to. So I think the adolescence is again an area that has been looked at a lot, and that's also a sort of a time period where some of these biases might be favoring boys less for various reasons. But using household survey data for situations of emergencies is a bit more difficult, because I think data collection there is a bit of a problem. So there we probably have to rely on other data.
I was wondering if it was applicable in the context of Sri Lanka.
Yeah, but then there just isn't data. There just isn't data about what the conflict means. But again, child soldiers and all that. Again, you can imagine that boys probably have mental health issues and post-traumatic disorders and schooling issues and disabilities. For example, that that's an issue that needs to be investigated further. I don't know which way it goes, but these are indeed, and I think, and that's a good point you raised, because I think in conflict situations in particular, there definitely will be situations where the gender bias is traditional and disfavoring women, but there would be biases that severely disfavor boys and men as well that we need to look at. Victoria?
The conflict in Sri Lanka is now finished.
Yes.
I like the way you've done the study and then gone back to the study later.
Yeah.
And so could you check the study now in the areas that were conflict affected? Because it's not just the conflict, they're Muslim, right? So that's
Tamil. So the conflict was in Tamil areas.
But it's really
Hindus.
Oh, it's Hindu.
It's Hindus, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
But that's a good idea. You can probably go back and look at whether you notice this sort of
Because it's culturally really different, isn't it, from the rest of China?
hard to say. I think it's always economy driven and money driven, like household economy. So if boys have less education, that's because they have to just go and earn to support the household. And if girls have more education, it's again for them to support the household and get a good job, they should pass their exams. So it's more the signaling effect of education. This is not just about labor market as well. This is about education policy. And this is about when you, as humanitarians, when you go off there and when you have your education interventions, think a bit carefully about what it is that that community actually needs. Do they need more formal education, more physics, chemistry, geography? Is that what they need? Or is it more sort of practical vocational education that has to be alongside this? I mean, you need to really, really think of what it is before jumping on bandwagons. Really think of what you need. I mean, in Sri Lanka, for example, why are boys just severely falling behind in formal education? They just have no interest, and it starts very, very early at every level of education. Girls are, I mean, this is true for OECD countries as well, right? This is true for university admissions in the UK, US as well. In Thailand, they found that smarter, the more able kids drop out of school earlier because they can make more in the labor market than actually spending more time in school. And so we seriously need to think of how we do this education business as well. Yeah, Scarlett.
I think you mentioned a statistic for something like 70% of the people who went into medical profession in Sri Lanka were women. And this was like related to the wider pattern of men going to like skilled labor jobs.
Unskilled.
Unskilled labor jobs, so more to like professions. And like you said, even in countries like the UK, higher education has a higher rate of women going in. So I just wondered if you thought that like the reasoning of women needing to better education to be successful applies the same to like first world countries like the UK and other places, or if that's just like the reason different.
That's a really good question. In the case of Sri Lanka, I think the labor market has a lot to do with it. So for the OECD countries, people tend to say that gender stereotyping has sort of a strong impact in boys not wanting to pursue higher education. So that's one of the arguments, not having enough male role models. That's in the education, so you don't have male teachers, for example, in schools. That could be a reason. They say different things, but nobody has found definitively what the reason is. Since I wrote that paper, though, they did the same for several other countries, and they noticed that even in Thailand, for example, you find this bias favoring girls in the run-up to exams. So you do find that bias, but that inequality that you notice is just a part of a bigger problem, a bigger issue that you need to investigate. Any other questions? We have about 3 minutes more. Yes, please.
Where did you get your data from? Did you collect it yourself?
So all this is based on secondary sources. So it's not primary data collection. And so you find almost all governments collect something called household income expenditure surveys. They collect labor force surveys very regularly. So there's just like a wealth of data out there, household survey data, that collects very, very detailed information, spending a lot of money that you can use. If you want to do an inter-country comparison, then it's good to use something like the World Bank's Living Standard Measurement Survey. Again, that's a household survey data, but because instruments are the same for all the countries, you can actually compare it to some extent. But then it's again subjective, like comparing things is subjective, but theoretically, technically, you can do it. But the data is available. Sure.
Yeah, actually, I'm very curious about when we're doing the gender research, how can we get rid of the bias that's from gender and from culture? Actually, this question is coming from when you're talking about the bride price in India. And, I know this a lot because when an Indian couple want to marry her children, girls, and they have to sort of offer such sort of price, and it do reminds me when in Chinese culture, and both male and the female, they have to offer to each other. Actually, I just check how to see that in English, but unfortunately, I can't find that. Generally speaking, for the boys, they have to offer much more than girls. So in terms of this, I'm pretty sure there will be a lot of different culture in such marriage issues. So as for a researcher, how can we to integrate such scenario without the influence of our own background?
So if I understand your question correctly, yes, I mean, you find bride price. So in the Middle East, you find the men have to come with some, it can be a nominal amount, but it's not like the dowry, but it's the men who have to give it. So your question is, how do we get rid of this?
Yeah. For example, if I'm involved into gender issue, actually I'm not expert on that, but if I'm really discuss about bride price, I probably will have more preference on the male because they have much more financial pressures in the marriage rather than the female, because I grew up in such culture, and it's I'm not sure it's a good or bad thing when we're doing into the research, but that's definitely, I'm pretty sure this will affect my research outcome, because
that's quite interesting. So with household survey data and this type of data, because our questionnaires are not open-ended, it's not interviews, right? Economists like to think that their analysis is objective, but then of course in its interpretation, maybe your own views probably come in. Although if you are a good researcher, you will want to just analyze the context for what it is and notice the patterns, but you wouldn't want to sort of intervene to change. It's not advocacy, right? You don't want to advocate this or something. You'll just notice the patterns and then state it. But I think what you're saying might be more of an issue in qualitative research. Maybe Victoria can help me, where when you interview, maybe your own biases might come in or might taint the study. I mean, that probably happens. I knew a qualitative researcher who once said that research is never objective. It is always subjective. It is always subjective. But it's just that you just tell the different positions so that it's clear which way you're going. Does anyone else have a comment about that? Or
they're full of comments on things like that because they're taking the anthropology module. We get nothing but everything. Felix is very good on this.
Go on, Felix. Tell us what you think.
I'm not 100% sure I get the whole question, but like we're talking about cultural bias and gender, I'd say that it's very important to say that we can change it. Like changing it, from what I can talk with the anthropologists, it's like saying that changing a gender bias would be a rather like ethnocentric way of putting it, and you don't want that because then it would just
Exactly. And the thing is, I mean, and this is very important with interventions also, right? So we have a particular premise, but we have to be very careful not to impose our beliefs, our ideologies on other communities. So yeah, I mean, I have a lot of reservation about interventions that try to change behavior. If the changing of the behavior was like washing hands more frequently so that you don't get COVID, that I find acceptable, that's reasonably okay. But then still, you know, if changing behavior is like in terms of changing some age-old practice, you always have that issue of who are we to impose the way we do things on others. I have two of, well, I really don't have much time, but I'll tell you a little story, like a 1 minute story. I was talking to a colleague over lunch, just somebody that I met in one of these conferences. Shall we stop the recording?